So our goal really was what research is needed to get to those clinical trials that will make a difference in people's lives.
There has been incredible scientific work being done in ME/CFS, but we need to organize it and pull it into the clinic and understand who can be helped.
I think we hit a transformational point.
And you need that diversity of perspective and technique and technology.
It is happening, and I can really start to feel it now.
Welcome to Make Visible, the podcast shining a light on complex chronic illness. I am your host, Emily Kate Stevens. Welcome to another episode of Make Visible. Welcome, Jez. How are you doing?
I haven't melted, but it's been a close run thing. And I'm sure many of our listeners, if they're based in the UK or Europe, will have been experiencing similar things over the last week or two.
Yeah, and we are considerably hotter, I believe, right now than the USA. For the people on this side, we are definitely suffering. And it is a theme with these conditions that there does seem to be a definite knock from the heat.
I think it's twofold. I think, first of all, there's the dysautonomia that results from the heat during the day. But then there's also the impact on actually sleep. Being able to sleep. And when sleep is so critical and there's such a struggle to reach deep sleep in complex chronic illness, and heat is one of the things that makes it particularly difficult for the body to settle into deep sleep. So we're getting even less deep sleep than usual, which is already not very much. And so we'll often feel particularly symptomatic during the days following. And then you've got the dysautonomic impact and the body's ability to manage itself during the day itself. And so when you put together day after day after day of hot weather, there's a cumulative effect and it can be really difficult.
So keep cool, people.
Well, here we go. My top tip. If you haven't done this before, get a towel, put it under the cold tap, then wring it out so it's just damp and cold, and put it around your neck during the day and have it on your body somewhere in bed during the night with a fan. And it makes the most unbelievable difference to actually keeping your body temperature down and stopping you getting overwhelmingly hot and sticky.
Fabulous. I'm going to try it.
Yeah, you should.
So we had a really good reception to the overview of long COVID that we did. And so I wanted to do similarly for our ME/CFS community. And so we have gone out and spoken to multiple different people who have been working in this field for collectively an incredibly long time to try and give an overview of where we are in terms of the science of ME/CFS, how that reflects for patients, and where we are in terms of treatments and the management of the condition. I'm going to start with an interview with Dr. Vicky Whittemore. Now, she is a program director at the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke at the National Institute of Health in the USA. And she oversees the grant portfolio for ME/CFS and is part of their trans working group. She has been a driving force behind the NIH creating a roadmap for ME/CFS research. This is her overview of the work that they've been doing in recent years. So let's take it from 2015, when you set up the ME/CFS working group, through to 2018 when you decided to, or 2019 was it, when you decided to try and create an ME/CFS roadmap, tried to create an overarching document, directive, would you say, of how we need to handle ME/CFS research?
Right. So our first effort, I think that was 2017, 2018, we had a working group of the NINDS Council that met together, and it included individuals from across the ME/CFS community, but really focused on infrastructure needs. So the need for more training or support for clinical fellows, to set up the biobank, to set up ways for data sharing. And so one of the recommendations from that report was that we needed a research roadmap. And that was now the second part that we just completed a year or more ago now, that really was more meant to look at where are the research gaps? How can we really facilitate research? What are the research priorities through the lens of what do we need to know to identify treatments for intervention to get to clinical trials, because you could describe the disease and describe the impact of the disease forever and never get to really testing treatments. So our goal really was what research is needed to get to those clinical trials that will make a difference in people's lives.
I've heard you before saying we have to know, what do we know, what don't we know, and what do we need to know. So
Exactly
it's just
right.
trying to establish the big gaps in our knowledge, but also in our strategies of how we treat patients, how we move things forwards with patients. So that was 2024 that you managed to create this, and it's a huge document. I will point people to it because the report of it is available for people to read and download, which has a wonderful summary that should be accessible to our audience, that identifies the areas that you are trying to make roads into. Would you be able to delve into those primary focus areas that you've identified so that those listening who are suffering with ME/CFS can understand the direction that we're trying to move in and the things that we are trying to discover? I say we, I just mean as a community. I'm not saying that I have any involvement in the phenomenal work that you are doing, but as a community, what are we trying to know?
I'll start by saying what was challenging about that whole effort was that there are so many research priorities, and that's what's reflected in that report, right? We had 8 different working groups, and it was impossible to get them to focus in on what are the 1 or 2 research priorities in your area. But having said that, I think it was really helpful to really understand how much we need to know. But in my mind, the 3 primary areas that we're really focused on are, first of all, the genetics. And there has been, within the last several months, just a phenomenal amount of information coming out from the CODA study in the UK. And there's another study that is going to really, I think, help focus us in on, there's not one gene that's responsible, but it's likely a number of genes. And so how can those findings help us to identify what the targets will be for treatment? The other part of that I think is so important, and I've always thought about this disease, is that it is so heterogeneous. And I think what we're going to find is that we're going to have to understand each person's private genetic makeup to really understand what is the best treatment for them. And it's not going to be the same for everyone. And so then that leads to really understanding, if we understand that component, how then is that impacting dysfunction in the nervous system that leads to both the autonomic nervous system defects, the brain fog, and other kinds of symptoms of the disease, as well as what's happening in the immune system, so that working together sort of across those areas, we can really come up with precision treatments for individuals with ME. And what I mean by that is, say I had ME and I had my genetic profile and it shows that I have all these genes that are much more heavily affecting the immune system, then you would target those treatments that way versus someone that had other genes that may show the very different symptoms, like much more pain symptoms and other symptoms of the disease. So you would target your treatments in a different way. So
that's absolutely fascinating. So you think that there might be a suggestion that the differing gene could lead to a different symptom set? Because I know what your belief at the moment is, that it could be many genes that lead to a susceptibility. It doesn't necessarily mean that you automatically then get ME/CFS, but it's that genetic makeup that leads you to a susceptibility. And then presumably that involves another factor, be it an infection or a burnout or some kind of trauma. And I'm not just simplifying and saying a psychological trauma, but a trauma to the body or the brain that could have the propensity for that genetic makeup to lead into ME/CFS. But that you think that it might be different genes lead to different types of ME/CFS because we've got such a heterogeneous disease here. Some people don't even necessarily believe that it is one condition because of the range of symptoms.
Right. I think you're right on that. It's polygenic, so there's multiple genes potentially that are involved, but there's some trigger, because many of us probably have some of those same gene changes, but never developed the disease. I think it's probably the unique combination of the genes, as well as then whatever that infectious trigger is that starts you down that road. And, for most people, the majority of people, it is an infectious disease that they just then don't recover from. Not everyone, but that's the majority of people. And so I think it's that hit to the immune system that then sets you on the path that your immune system just can't cope and can't recover. And then that leads to many of the other symptoms that you see in ME/CFS.
So genetics is area one that you're very excited about and is a primary focus. What are the other two? You said there were 3 priorities that you considered we need to look at.
Right. So being in the Neurological Institute, obviously that's one of my prime interests as well. And there's really compelling information now, data coming out that shows really significant inflammation, not just in the brain, but throughout the body. Michelle James at Stanford has some really amazing work that she's been doing recently with whole body imaging that shows inflammation throughout the body, which leads to the third area in some ways, which is the immune system. But I'm just really very interested in how the brain becomes inflamed and how we could reverse that. And if we were able to either prevent or reverse that inflammation in the brain, how would that then impact brain fog, all the other neurological symptoms that we see in individuals with ME? And so you can really pinpoint what's happening and where. And what's really happening is that those immune cells are reacting to some sort of trigger that then causes them to really become much more reactive than normal. And what we know now about ME is that there's a phenomenon, and this leads to the third area, the immune system, called T-cell exhaustion, which means the one type of immune cell is really trying to react but can't. And so it's sort of a cycle that happens where there's some sort of trigger, the immune system reacts. If it can't fully react, it just keeps trying and leads to ongoing irritation, inflammation of these cells in the brain or in whatever body part.
Okay. So I've actually heard you talking in an interview before about your frustration that there were investigators looking at studying B cells, T cells, autoantibodies, but there was no cohesion in tying it all together. In terms of where we are now, as we start down this road into looking at that immune system and your role as creating this grant portfolio of ME/CFS, how is that now being tied together to look at the immune system and the way that these cells are impacting the bodies of people with these chronic fatigue conditions?
So that's research that's more coordinated and supported through the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease with Dr. Breen.
Mm-hmm.
But I would say that there's much more open discussion and collaboration between the researchers at this point, in that people studying these various different parts of the immune system are really beginning to come together and not only working in different parts, but replicating each other's work such that we can really say what you're seeing is also seen by this other group that saw exactly the same thing. And how can we bring these people together to say, how is this all being triggered? How does it all interact? And one of the things I know Dr. Nath is interested in is what comes first, the horse or the cart? What is happening that you first have the infection and the immune response, but then what happens down the road to involve all these other parts of the immune system and then affect other parts of the body?
Jez, the NIH has historically received criticism from the ME/CFS community in terms of their handling of the condition. We have heard before that they have definitely endeavored to bring on a lot more patient involvement and a lot more patient feedback Tell me your thoughts on their proposed ideas.
Well, I think that the principle of putting together a strategic roadmap for how to approach a condition like this that has so far eluded academic consensus when it comes to what the hell is going on with it over the last 30 years, you could spend a century going down blind alleys because it is such a complex illness that is obviously so multi-system, and the speed of research means that any research project you do, you're looking at a 5-year time horizon on. You could easily have 20 of them that run consecutively, and you're looking at a century of going down the wrong blind alleys. So spending a bit of time, even if that time constitutes years, not months, to understand what the highest probability avenues to go down are and to order them in priority and importance, and then to choose which of these you run concurrently, I think is of absolutely critical importance. So when it comes to having a strategic roadmap, had we had a strategic roadmap 30 years ago, I think we'd be in a very different place now. Now, maybe we didn't have the research at that time, 30 years ago, to be able to create the strategic roadmap. You need to have some decades of knowledge built up before you can do it effectively. But certainly, it gives me faith when I hear that this is the way that they are going about it, because it means that we're more likely to get to constructive, productive, reliable answers and ultimately effective treatments sooner than we would without it.
And I had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Vicky Whittemore at the recent Invest in ME conference where she spoke. One of her key priorities is to create cohesion in the way that we gather data. And I just think it's incredible, this idea that we don't currently, across medical systems, have this rigorous standardized data that enables us to look at multiple different studies and bring them together. So the work that she is doing now and has done historically is incredibly respected in this space. One of the things that we definitely need when you think about the vastness of those different subjects that are proposed by the NIH MECFS roadmap is we need people to come together. So they're pulling out different systems, but what we really need is people to start coming together and stop working in complete siloed systems and work out how we can collaborate. But then we need to put these systems all back together and start looking at the patient as a whole, as an individual, but as a whole, and stop working in these siloed systems. And I do think that it is incredible, the collaboration that is going on in this space. Here is Amy Rocklin, who is the CEO of the Complex Disorders Alliance. And they really are trying to bring together multiple different organizations to work out how to not only treat the patient as an individual, but work out how we are to move the science from the labs and actually get that into clinics and get that to the patient. Here's what Amy had to say. You are looking at long COVID, but you're also looking at MECFS. So we really are beginning to see MECFS being brought into the fray, sometimes as a control, but sometimes as a separate or a different marker, often a different time point in terms of the disease, because obviously a lot of people with MECFS have been suffering with it for a long time. I imagine it's a huge amount of work just to get these trials in place when you're dealing with one condition. But to then bring in another condition is huge. But it is huge, huge, huge for the community. And the other thing that I love about the way that you've just described it is an organization such as the Complex Disorders Alliance has that ability to take these people from different organizations and different standpoints, be they scientists, be they clinicians, and actually bring them together. So you're creating a collaborative that is ultimately working to reach that downstream point of actually treating patients. And this is one of the things that is apparent as you go through your research portfolio, that essentially, whilst you're absolutely dedicated to understanding the science, every single one of your initiatives is essentially trying to work out how you get to a point that you are treating a patient. Rather than just being some abstract theory. Oh, yes, we found this. How does that translate for patients?
And that's honestly the best part is I say often we stand on the shoulders of incredible science. I'm grateful to everyone. There has been incredible scientific work being done in MECFS specifically, but we need to organize it and pull it into the clinic and understand who can be helped. The patient population has suffered because the age-old siloed system is much more complex in multisystemic disorders, and it's very, very difficult to organize that. So I look at some of the science that's been done, and I'm very curious that we haven't moved it into the clinic yet. There's some very well-intentioned clinicians and very expert clinicians that will be reading publications and trying to get that done. But we have they've got to be given the tools to treat people. And long COVID clearly has helped us in terms of understanding these conditions through another lens, which is a viral trigger that perhaps it has triggered, and it may also still be laying latent in some patients. And understanding the field of persistence is incredibly important. But Lyme has also been doing that, right? So you look, and I look at the ME/CFS population where there could be some sort of persistence that is driving their dysfunction, and we can learn from other conditions, whether that's EBV, or when we dig deep into the biology quickly, what we can say is, okay, subtype, what do we know? All right, biomarkers, we see a few indicators. Let's get patients organized by that science, and let's do a quick study rather than just waiting for one doctor to recognize the science and publication and do it individually in their clinic. So it's about doing things at scale and faster, but it's really treatment focused. Really, really treatment focused.
And do you think that we have those fairly clearly defined subtypes in ME/CFS in the same way that they formed in long COVID? Or are we beginning to understand those different pictures?
I think we're at the beginning of all of it. And that's one of the things I think as a parent I learned was I had to be very open to change. Science is about learning and change. That is what science is. You learn, you keep moving forward. You learn something else, you keep moving forward. And so I've had to adapt in for my own child to say, okay, what I knew 10 years ago is the basis. I may see it through a different lens. And now I'm recognizing that maybe she gets treated this way because of what we know better. So for ME/CFS, long COVID, I think we're just at the beginning of these subtypes. But I think that pressing on the researchers and clinicians to say, share your subgroups with us so we can test them in our own AI-driven system so that we can start to even more deeply subtype patients.
Another person who is incredibly respected in this space, and again, their organization has done a similar thing in terms of research priorities, is Sonia Chowdhury, who is the CEO of ActionForME. She has been heading up ActionForME for the last 14 years. And the work that they have actually enabled collaboration on really, really seems to be making a difference in this space. Here's what she had to say.
There could be researchers out there that have never been involved in ME, that actually, if we can involve them and say, this is an area, bring your expertise and come into this illness field, then actually that would be a win for everybody, regardless of what they find. So our hope is that we will start to see, if we look back in 10 years or in 2032, we look back and say, actually, out of those priorities, we've seen research here and here and here and here, and this one has had no research or has had very little research. How do we now put our weight behind that to try and bring people in? As an organisation, ActionForME focused on genetics specifically because of our involvement in the CODA study. As an organisation, I hadn't thought we'd ever be involved directly in research in the way that we are now. I saw our role as very much working in the background, trying to get the funding, bringing together collaborations and saying, right, off you go and work your magic. And actually what we found is that our involvement has helped facilitate that lived experience, involvement and engagement. And that's become a particular niche for us as an organisation. And therefore, we have remained committed to doing that. And because of CODA, we set up the Genetic Centre of Excellence, which was really the idea behind it was, how do we increase and accelerate science from a genetic perspective to build on CODA, so all that data didn't go to waste. And that group, the partnership group that we've got, which includes researchers and people with lived experience, were very much behind the PRIME application and worked with us on that application that went in twice in the end before we were successful with that.
Quite remarkable. The strapline, the mission for ActionForME is taking action, delivering impact. And I think that the way that you work with the patients hopefully really enables people to feel that you are having that impact, because you're involved in some pretty huge projects here. And I hope that the community is aware of the shift that some of those projects are going to enable, not just at a high level, but in getting treatments. I think on the research priorities, number 2, I think, is repurposing existing drugs. And your work that you have done on CODA, on genetics, your work with Precision Life is all directing us to a position that we might be able to not look 10 years down the line for treatments, but we might be able to get treatments for the correct people soon, which is massive. I know it still doesn't bring back people's the last 30 years, but
no, and nothing will. I mean, that's the truth of the situation. Nothing will. But actually, to have treatments, and it will be treatments, there will be no one treatment, because there are subsets of ME. There are different types of ME, and people are likely to need quite personalised care, as we see in other illnesses. And so I do believe that those treatments are, when I started 14 years ago, I wasn't sure in my tenure in the organisation I'd see those treatments come to fruition. I honestly didn't believe that was possible. But that feels possible now, and not in 10 years' time, but in the very near future. And it's interesting because I've had conversations with Steve Gardner from Precision Life. We need to take an eclectic approach to this. We need the genetics, which takes time. Sequence ME and long COVID is going to take time to deliver, as CODA has done. And we need to have those genetics. But at the same time, we need those novel techniques that are identifying. The day we got the results from Leucomi with a list of potential drug targets was phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. And if we'd waited for the genetics only, we wouldn't have had that. But equally, you can't just have that, because pharma companies will also want genetics. And there'll be other things that we'll find through the genetics that we wouldn't find in other ways. So we've got to approach this situation and this problem from a number of different angles and perspectives. And you need that diversity of perspective and technique and technology.
What the referencing of CODA and the Leucomi study and the work that ActionForME has brought together there has actually enabled huge amounts of data analysis across thousands of ME/CFS patients. And I think it is that sort of scale of study that is actually beginning to drive momentum. Another organisation who has been absolutely instrumental in this field historically is the Bateman Hor Centre. Obviously, we have spoken previously to Lucinda Bateman. We've spoken to Suzanne Vernon. And I had the pleasure of talking to Talia Ruscioni, who was their Director of Education and is now the Executive Director of the Bateman Hor Centre, who are really, really trying to drive change, not just amongst the science, but amongst the patient community. If you compare now where we are in 2026 with your understanding of this kind of condition, when you first experienced it within your family, how far have we moved the needle in terms of our understanding of ME/CFS?
That is a loaded question. So in one of our clinician hour meetings recently, we were talking about just this and looking back at the research roadmap through the NIH and what that created. That was instrumental for ME/CFS, long COVID, and these other neuroimmune conditions. the research that's being done and expedited in a way that we've never really seen until a pandemic happened. It's terrible that that was the case. We can look at the political landscape right now and start to worry or get concerned that constraints are being put back on. And yet, I think it's already happening. The momentum has moved, and it can be so hard to feel that when you're in your bed, you've lost part of your life, you've lost a significant piece of who you are. And what we were talking about is that we actually feel really hopeful right now that change is happening. And every time we do a lecture, I would say from where I started in 2019, kind of begging for people to just let us in or having to find a back end way of talking about ME/CFS to then present them with a case definition. We're not there anymore. And that is so positive to see that people are coming to us saying, I'm seeing this, what do I do? That's change, right? That doesn't feel like you can actually put a number on it. You can't quantify it in some way, but it is happening. And that just feels hopeful. And I know hopeful is a dangerous word to use, but we are seeing it. It is starting to happen. And so for people who are listening, I would say it may not be your experience yet, but I do see it in your future that you're going to be met with more understanding. You're going to be met with now these trials that are very directed towards things that patients can access eventually for medications and interventions, right? So it is happening, and I can really start to feel it now.
It's amazing because I think, look, I've seen a shift through this space in the last 6 years. And obviously, probably 3 years ago, there was anger amongst some of the ME community that long COVID had come along and not taken a spotlight from ME/CFS, because let's be honest, there was never a spotlight on it, but it had taken a place and taken up resources in an area that people have been begging for decades to have help and to have research. But I think from what you've just said there, that spotlight actually has now begun to swing round to encompass ME/CFS, because certainly as well, some of the first people that I was interviewing in maybe 2021, 2022, there was pushback on the NIH Recover initiative because people felt that it was unfair to a degree and they weren't involving some of the people who have understanding in complex chronic post-infectious, perhaps, who have had this experience for decades, and they weren't necessarily involving those people. But I think that once people started seeing that these people have been brought in and have then started forming an integral part of the NIH roadmap and the Recover TLC initiative, I feel like there might be a little more cohesion between the two worlds. And perhaps long COVID has enabled us to do something in ME/CFS that without that horrific situation of the pandemic and whatever the figure is right now, 400 million people being affected, ME/CFS might still be in the same position that we were in 2019.
I would align with what you're saying. For Bateman Hor, we saw it as opportunity to finally get ME out there, because what we were seeing with long COVID, we knew it, right? We knew this was coming. And so we opened an entire long COVID arm in 2021, knowing that shortly thereafter, in a 6-month time period, patients could be meeting the criteria for ME/CFS. We saw opportunity to really look at the ME diagnosis, the pathophysiology, in both an acute way and then longitudinally, which is what the pandemic has allowed us to do, right? Not every long COVID patient meets ME/CFS criteria. And, we have to throw those caveats out there, but it gave us a window to see it when it first started. And then how do we see how that changes over time? Can earlier interventions really help? Yes. What are those interventions? It's all individualized. I was listening to one of your other podcasts the other day where you were talking about everybody's post-infectious presentation can be driven largely by something else. And yet there is still a foundation of care that we can meet these patients at. And so even in the research, we've had opportunity to educate. We've been in front of these researchers and scientists before they do the study design, talking about post-exertion malaise, talking about pacing, talking about the dysautonomia. So I think it's really hard, once again, when you're inside this body to see that change is happening, but that gave us a window to be able to do what ME has long been needing, which was the lens for everybody to start taking this seriously and to put the resource and funding behind it. So I agree with you. I think it brought us along and it gave us both opportunity and a lane that many of us were able to both infiltrate and take advantage of.
Talia mentioned there that this idea of individualized interventions. And I think this is where we have been struggling for so long with ME/CFS, is this fact that it has been treated as one disease. And the treatment options given to one person are not necessarily appropriate for another person. I was therefore hugely excited by the Decode ME study, which has really, really drilled down into the genetics. And then a company called Precision Life, who are an organisation who do AI precision medicine for complex disease, have started working with that Decode ME data and created analysis of it, which I really think moves the needle in terms of our understanding of the condition and of the treatment options. Here is a conversation with their CEO, Steve Gardner. You said that we are in an early stage of the disease. When we're talking about ME, people will say we are 30 years down the line, really, in terms of our scientific trying to get some understanding on it. That, if we think back also to the Human Genome Project in the early 90s, how far do you feel that we have come as a scientific field in terms of our understanding and what we have the potential to do for ME/CFS patients?
I think we hit a transformational point with the publication of our last paper. And I don't say that just because it's our paper. It was a collaboration between ourselves, Decode ME, ActionForME, Innovate UK funded the Leukomy project. We had fabulous PPI resource on there. We were obviously in contact with Mello and the Complex Disorders Alliance as well. What that paper showed is that it's not that we can't find the genes associated with the disease. It's that there are too many genes associated with the disease. This is not one disease. It's technically what we call polygenic, and it's technically what we call heterogeneous. So polygenic, for your listeners, I can draw an analogy. When we were doing the cancer stuff, it's what we call monogenic. It's a little bit like being in a room with one speaker. It's incredibly easy to hear what the signal is. You can understand the voice really easily. Polygenic means there's lots of things going on at the same time. And it's a little bit like a networking environment, where everybody's making sense in their own conversations, but they are conflicting with each other. They are making it difficult to understand any of the messages. And then heterogeneous on top of that means they're speaking different languages. So now you have a networking environment with 6 different languages being spoken. That's why we couldn't pick out a single message, because it was so complex. And the tools that were set up to deal with cancer and rare disease just don't work as well when you have that level of complexity. What we've demonstrated, we've got a track record of 4 major publications in this space. I've talked about reproducibility of results, consistency of overlap of results, multiple methodologies used on these. We've had confirmatory studies from others. We have now proved that there are hundreds of genes involved in this disease. And therefore, I am going to use the transformational word. Therefore, our understanding of how we should go about studying this disease, how we should go about designing clinical trials, how we should think about how to impact the disease within patients is fundamentally different from where it was, let's say, 3-4 years ago.
Yeah.
Now we understand we have to do stratification just like we do with cancers these days. We have to do the genetics. We have to understand the mechanisms at work in individual patients, and we have to design therapies for them at an individual level out of a combination of medications that are most likely to work for them individually. That is a fundamentally different starting point. And by the way, we have 260 genes now that we can go after. We have 42 repurposing candidates that we can trial. We have suddenly built out this landscape from stumbling around in the dark. We switched the light on, and now we can see it. We haven't solved it yet, but we can see all of the major points on the map that we should go and investigate and explore. And I think that is a profound shift in where we are with the disease. And it gives me great hope that we're going to be able to find solutions for patients much quicker.
That is incredible. You wrote that the study reinforces that ME is a complex multisystemic condition with a clear genetic basis. And I think it is that clear genetic basis that, for patients, takes it from being something that has been so stigmatized and ignored and blamed on the patient, because you have that scientific evidence that there's this genetic basis for it, which is remarkable.
And it's unarguable now. While we were trying to find one SNP or one gene and nobody was really agreeing with each other, everybody has their own theory about which things are involved. They're probably all right, but not for the same patient. So different subgroups of patients. Now we have unequivocal, peer-reviewed, multiple times, multiply replicated results that are out there that demonstrate there is really strong biological basis for the disease.
Jez, am I overexcited about this science?
I don't think so. So I think the genetics angle on this is a brilliant sidestep to the phenotyping problem we've got, because we still haven't got any idea of what these phenotypes should be. And even once you have identified the phenotypes, let's say 1 through 5, the causes of, I might be in phenotype 3 along with Sarah. Actually, what's driving our very similar symptom presentation may not be quite the same mechanism, and how we go after sorting that out might require different immune modulation if we are addressing the immune dysfunction as part of the causality here. And how would we know how to treat me and Sarah with the same symptom presentation unless we had our genetic makeup, which told us that she needed to be on medication 1, 3, and 4, and I needed to be on 2, 4, 6, and 8. And then suddenly you've got a much more powerful way of not just understanding the condition, but treating it too. This is where I think it beautifully sidesteps the phenotyping problem, because phenotyping itself is going to require agreement, and in itself it's less precise. This is definitive in a sense. Now, what becomes less definitive is how effective these drugs are, that we have to try and modulate that immune response, if that's the angle we're going for. But it's certainly a much more precision-targeted approach. Now, what becomes slightly more difficult here is, what world can you imagine where you go and see your GP, in the UK at least, and they do a genetic test on you? And it feels to me like that's a scenario that's still some way off. But if we start to get some RCTs here that show proper effectiveness, then it might actually force some rethinking of how we have service provision for people with ME/CFS. How do we change that mindset? We're going to have to create some guidelines, we're going to have to get some consensus. But all of this fundamentally is movement in the right direction. And it's not a surprise to me that it's going to necessitate some lateral thought, when so far conventional thought hasn't produced any answers.
Well, one of the things to say from the CODA study that Precision Life then used for their data analysis, CODA actually gathered that information from a spit tube. This is what enabled that study, and this is why it's so groundbreaking. They did not call 16,500 people into a doctor's office. They sent out home spit tests. Now, that still actually prevents people with very, very severe ME from being able to contribute, because actually even building up that amount of spit is a challenge. And even filling in the questionnaire was too much for some people with very severe ME. However, it did manage to gather data from a huge group of ME/CFS patients who are so often missed from any study that involves travelling to a test site. So yes, I agree with you. The way in which this kind of stuff filters down into a GP surgery, into a primary care space, might be challenging, and that remains to be seen how that might be done. But because you have organisations like ActionForME and patient organisations involved in the design of some of this, I do feel that we are stepping in the right direction in terms of less invasive testing that is producing more detailed and much, much broader results.
Yes, I completely agree. I feel like listening to Steve's interview, it felt a little bit like over the last decades, we've had different researchers, clinicians, academics standing on different islands out in the Pacific Ocean, kind of shouting out across to each other, trying to communicate with each other from their own points of perspective and knowledge and research. And what it feels like here is that we've actually got a bit of flat land that's been sort of established, built on solid scientific basis that we can build out from. Actually, maybe it's a bridge that links some of these islands together. And actually, it feels like this is a really powerful building block to establish where we go from here. And again, research takes a long time, and I don't think we can be expecting treatments on the table super quickly. But if it's about that roadmap and about understanding where we go next, this is a really powerful piece in that roadmap, I believe.
Referencing your multiple different people who have been shouting for so long, this kind of science actually corroborates many of them in being entirely correct in their hypotheses and entirely correct in the things that they were chasing, and hopefully brings together an understanding as to why they were right, but how they are not necessarily right in all cases, and that differentiation between all of the individuals. And this idea of individualized care that could come from this potential testing is huge.
I think it's going to be essential. We've been saying for a long time, it's never going to be a one magic pill for everybody type scenario, and it's always going to require personalized, holistic care. But we haven't really known what that might look like. And now I think we're getting a sense for what that might look like.
I did want to just bring another angle, another voice. We have heard from the clinicians, we've heard from those patient advocacy organisations. I think all of these organisations actually are incredible in terms of patient advocacy. But I wanted to bring in someone from a different angle. And this is a short comment that I got from David Tuller. Now, you've spoken to David before. He is a senior fellow in public health at the University of California in Berkeley. But he is someone who has been working as an advocate for ME/CFS patients since he challenged the results of the PACE trial. And this was a very long piece of advocacy work that he did. And it took several years, but actually, his work enabled momentum to actually be able to change dangerous guidelines that had been given to ME/CFS patients. Actually, I think they ran for almost 10 years in the end. Because the PACE trial came out in 2011, didn't it?
Yes.
And the guidelines were changed eventually by NICE in 2021. Here's what David had to say. So do you think that there is exciting studies specifically in ME/CFS coming out of the UK and Europe?
I think that the CODA study, which was a genome-wide association study that was done out of the University of Edinburgh and was funded in large part by UK government, interesting findings. They did 15,000 or more DNA samples of patients who had been diagnosed and found certain points on the genome that seemed to be suggesting that these were genetic links that had a role in the pathogenesis of the illness. And I think those were exciting findings. I'm not a biologist or a doctor, so I can't really speak to that. But as I understand it from people, those were things. But again, to develop anything from that, there's follow-ups to that, but that takes a long time between that and actually getting medications to people, which is what people want.
Yeah. Well, there are still huge leaps to make because we need to identify that science, identify those genetic components, work out who would actually benefit from what sort of treatment, and then start developing and bringing in the treatments that would help them. So that makes it sound like everything's a long way off. Do you think that we have traveled some distance since you first started looking at this?
Well, I mean, I think that we've traveled some distance in the sense that I think there are more people that recognize that there's a clinical entity there. It's not just a mishmash of people complaining about symptoms, and that it's something that needs to be solved. I think a lot of patients would say that they don't experience that difference on the ground, and that depends upon the country, too. I think that's very true in the UK. I'd say in the US, I hear more from people where people are more likely to be able to pick their own doctors than in other countries. In a country where you don't have a national health care system like ours, if you have good insurance and if you have good access, you're able to maybe get a care that you prefer. In places where you do have a national health care system, which is fair overall because everybody can get something, you also tend to have less choice. If you have access, you have less choice. So you're stuck with your GP, or you go to a different GP. If you're in this city, you can't go to that city, or you can't go to a specialist. So I think in some contexts, people feel like they can get better care. And in other places, like in the UK, I still hear all the time people complaining about their GP doesn't say anything or do anything or know anything, and they don't really have an outcome. So I think it's different about what's happening on the research level, probably, and what's happening at the level of patient experience.
So I think this is the age-old problem, Jez, of I wanted to bring people hope with this conversation and understanding, but it still comes back down to that idea of how does it reach the patient? Great ideas. How does this translate down? Well, back to Amy Rocklin. Here's what she had to say on the power of actually working together.
Understanding who the key players are and bringing them together is really exciting for us.
Love that effort and spirit of collaboration. You have mentioned multiple different organizations who, for someone like you, could be seen as the competition. We're talking a lot of them, non-profits, ActionForME, SolveME, OMF, Polybio.
The Schmidt Initiative.
The Schmidt Initiative I've got written down here.
We and Me in Europe is doing incredible work. The CODA initiative is incredible, which is ActionForME. I also, so Sonia Chowdhury, who runs ActionForME, there's an effort we're all doing in genomics, which I love, which is building off of CODA, which is one of the richest databases of genetic information for ME/CFS, and now building into long COVID. Dr. Chris Ponting has been championing that work for a while, and he's extraordinary. But Sonia was able to bring together CODA, SolveME, the Schmidt Initiative for long COVID, We and Me, to do early funding of a phase 1 aspect of Sequence ME and long COVID, which is going to build the largest longitudinal long read database to be analyzed for ME and long COVID. Incredible base of knowledge that needs to get done. And went to all of us and asked us for a relatively small commitment in comparison. And that yielded 4.5 million pounds of support from the UK government. And Sonia is someone who I just value as a leader because I can call her and say, have you done this before? Should we be doing something like this? Who are the leaders in this space? And it's that level of trust that I think we're all building with one another is really important for patients. Not one group is going to solve this whole thing. And so we're going to do better together. And that's something we've really tried to foster.
That's absolutely incredible. I love the collaboration with which you're approaching this. I do hope that your description of that, the fact that that's coming together of those groups, then provokes the UK government to give £4.5 million shows to our audience that through organisations such as yours, there is movement. And we're not talking about just small grassroots movement. We are talking about big investment and big movement. And I just want to highlight that for our listeners, because I think it shows that with people like you, with your really approaching it from so many angles of the empathy, the understanding, the research, but then coming at it with this business brain enables us to move from doing small scale individual studies to actually trying to create a huge power and a big movement together. And that's not something that people can do by themselves. It's not something that you can do by yourself. I'm not sitting here flattering you, but I'm just saying approaching it with that angle and with that ability to look at how do we scale this? This is how we have the potential to see movement amongst these conditions.
Yeah, I think you've hit it on the head. And I think the hope is that by us all coming together, you feel the impact of what it is we're doing. It is a system of making this work faster. But I still know it's not fast enough. And I mean that sincerely. I still lie awake every night thinking about the people I've spoken to, the young women that can't get out of bed. I am not someone who's a Pollyanna in this space. I am someone who is determined, and I find other determined people like yourself so that we can move faster, because people are so sick, and I just refuse to accept that has to be. I just don't want that to be for them. And I think with some additional work, we can make this happen faster.
And a final thought from Steve Gardner.
There's more science to be done. There's more research and validation work to be done. But these are stepping stones that we need to make with the disease in order to be able to understand it better and to have those tools that we could then use in the clinic once we do have some medicines that work, to guide people towards things that are actually going to be effective for them.
For them. And that is the key to what you're trying to do. Jez, what do you think of that as
whole picture?
A whole picture.
So I think one word I would like to pull out from it is hopeful. And I think that is fair, but it's still going to require patience, as David Tiller said. We may have a very effective roadmap to go forwards from. We may have some science that has created bridges between these silos out there on their islands in the Pacific Ocean, and we can actually start to, build a rocket on those bridges that can fire off with effective treatments, but that's going to take RCTs. And this isn't like we've discovered there's a bacterial infection, we just need to trial some antibiotics and see which works. The treatments which we need to trial and get through phase 1, 2, 3 and RCTs are complex, and there's going to be different combinations, and that polygenic picture that we're looking at is not going to be a simple puzzle to solve in terms of which treatments get thrown at which different genetic profiles. However you slice and dice it, 5 years is optimistic, I think.
Yeah. And the thing is that although we are not necessarily talking about developing whole new drugs and bringing them to market, and there is this idea that there are drugs with pharma companies that are in production and they're tested to a certain degree, but they could be repurposed, there is still that process of RCTs, randomized controlled trials, that are needed for us to understand their efficacy in this condition. So whilst a lot of the time safety standards in other conditions will have been adhered to, as we know from the graded exercise and so forth, what is appropriate in other conditions is not necessarily safe in ME/CFS. You can't just make that assumption.
It's very true. And so there is a degree of complexity to where we go from here, even if it feels like we've got a really good platform to start jumping off. But there is going to be a degree of complexity, and it is going to require a huge amount of collaboration and good science and funds ultimately to get the research done. So yes, it is hopeful, but again, I think the other key word is patience. And in the meantime, we just have to look after ourselves as best we can.
Look after ourselves and look after each other. But it definitely gives me hope to know that there are these people who are genuine forces of nature out there trying to make a difference to the population of people with ME/CFS who have effectively been ignored for decades. Jez, it has been an absolute pleasure, and I very much look forward to the next time that we get to do this.
Me too.
Thank you for listening to Make Visible. Please do like, follow, or subscribe to listen to our next episode, where we'll be uncovering more insights into complex chronic illness. This was brought to you by the team at Visible, a group of scientists and engineers whose lives have been affected by energy-limiting health conditions. We're building wearable technology that's helping 100,000 people measure and manage their complex chronic illness. To find out more about what we're working on and how Visible could help you, visit our website at makevisible.com.